I came back from Iraq a different man. Not broken, just quieter. The desert has a way of baking things out of you, burning away the noise until all that's left is clarity. Harsh, unfiltered, and honest. I'd spent 13 months breathing sand, hearing the whistle of wind and mortars, watching the world through the dusty lens of a Humvee window. I thought the hardest part was over. I thought coming home would be the easy bit. A driveway, a hug, my daughter's voices calling out from the porch. But war's a funny thing. It doesn't always end when the fighting stops. It was a Tuesday. I still remember the chill in the air, the way the early frost glazed the windshield of the rental car. I was halfway from the base to what I still called home when the message came in, a vibration in my pocket, a tone I'd heard 1,000 times before. I pulled over just before the bridge, partly instinct, partly dread. The message was from Jane. Not a welcome, not a smile, just 12 words that took the breath from my lungs. The girls don't want to see you. The marriage is over. I stared at that screen like it might change if I waited long enough. I scrolled up. No warning, no build-up. Just a clean break, a guillotine drop. My chest tightened. Not rage, not yet. Just the kind of silence that follows a roadside blast, where your ears ring and the world slows down. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I slid the phone back in my pocket and shifted the car into drive. That's the thing about soldiers. We don't freeze. We move, even when the floor drops out from under us. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was empty. Curtains drawn. Mail piled up. Like the life I left had packed itself into boxes while I was gone. I walked through the front door and took a breath, and there it was. The lavender soap she always used. Still lingering. I sat down on the edge of the couch, that message echoing in my head, and stared at the family photo on the wall. Me in uniform, Jane beside me, the girls in matching dresses. A portrait of something that never really existed the way I thought it did. I didn't call her, didn't write back. Instead, I sat in that silence, wrapped in the soft hum of the heater kicking on, and let the realization settle like dust after a detonation. My wife was gone. My girls had been turned against me. And whatever this wasn't heartbreak. This was the start of a different kind of war. And I knew exactly what I had to do. There's a particular kind of silence that wraps itself around you after betrayal. It's not the quiet of peace. No, it's the hush before a storm, where every breath feels loaded and the air hangs thick with the weight of what's about to come. That was me, sitting in an empty house, my boots still dusty from deployment, staring at a wall that used to be home. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I didn't even call her. That's not how I was built. I've seen what panic does to people in a war zone. It gets you killed. It gets your men killed. And so instead, I did what I've always done when the world starts burning. I planned. The first move was tactical. I went to the strongest weapon I could find on civilian soil, a lawyer with a name that made even seasoned divorce attorneys flinch. I remembered his name from a whispered conversation in a base chapel years ago. One of the guys said, "If she ever takes your kids and runs, this guy's the one you call." I never thought I'd need that information. But that morning, it felt like divine intervention. I didn't walk into his office like a victim. I walked in like an officer reporting for duty. He didn't ask how I was holding up, didn't need to. He looked at the file I handed him, glanced up at me, and nodded. That was all the sympathy I wanted. What I needed was action, and that's exactly what I got. Within 48 hours, he had motions filed. The joint accounts were frozen. My access to financial records restored. Subpoenas sent to Jane's employers, her email providers, even the school administration that handled our girls' records. I watched the machine move, fast and clinical like a well-oiled military op. And for the first time in days, I felt like I was back in control. But it wasn't just about legal papers. It was about intel. I started combing through the data we pulled like I was back in a TOC, scanning drone footage for insurgents. There were gaps in her calendar. Unexplained weekends, travel expenses listed as retreats and training seminars. But no locations, no receipts, just silence. And that kind of silence, it always hides something. She'd moved fast, withdrawn cash, changed passwords, set up a P.O. box in another county. She was treating this like an escape, not a divorce, an extraction. That told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just done with the marriage. She was done with me, my history, even my daughter's connection to me. And that crossed the line. So I went deeper, pulled archived messages from the cloud, recovered old voicemail transcriptions. Jane had always underestimated me in this department, thought I was just a soldier, not a strategist. But war teaches you things. Teaches you that people lie, that they mask their intentions. And if you want the truth, you have to dig beneath the surface. You have to look for the fault lines. And what I found, that was just the beginning. It started with a name, just 5 letters and a shadow I'd ignored too many times. William Smith. You wouldn't think a name like that could punch the air from your lungs, but when it showed up in a financial statement, tied to $5,000 wired out of our joint account the same week I was leading a convoy through a sandstorm in Anbar. Well, it hit different. William had always been there, tucked into the edges of our marriage. Just Bill from college, she used to say, waving it off with a laugh. You'd like him. Totally harmless. And I believed her. God help me, I believed her. Because I was a soldier, and she was the woman I'd trusted to keep the home fires burning. But the truth was, Bill hadn't been harmless. He'd been patient, quiet, waiting in the wings like an understudy for my life. The deeper I dug, the clearer it got. She hadn't just stumbled into his arms after a rough patch. This had been methodical. Flight records, Airbnb receipts, transfer logs. One hotel in San Diego listed both their names. A romantic weekend while I was conducting night raids with a platoon of 18-year-olds praying they'd make it home. You start connecting those dots, and it stops feeling like betrayal. It starts feeling like premeditation. But it wasn't just the affair. That was the appetizer. The main course was what came next, plans to relocate. Not just a getaway, not a reset. I'm talking full-on exfiltration. Italy, Florence, to be exact. Jane's passport had been renewed quietly, a new name registered under her maiden initials. Her emails hinted at an opportunity for a fresh start. She was sending school documents for our daughters overseas, aligning calendars with William's sister, a woman who lived in a villa outside the city. I found photos tucked into cloud storage, the courtyard, the lavender field, the guest room labeled for the girls. And my name? Nowhere. She was going to disappear, leave the country, take my daughters and vanish into a postcard-perfect European life where I was reduced to a name on a birth certificate and a cautionary tale. And all the while, I'd be the guy holding an American flag on a tarmac, thinking I was coming home to something solid. The irony didn't escape me. I'd seen warlords smuggle families through broken borders. Now, I was watching my own wife plan the same kind of escape, just with better lighting and fewer checkpoints. But this wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. This was about my girls, my blood. And Jane, the woman I thought I knew, had made one critical error. She'd underestimated what a soldier becomes when you turn his mission into something personal. I started gathering more than just evidence. I pulled their texts, flagged the conversations about when the time is right, about waiting until the divorce settles. I watched how William coached her, how he played the soft-spoken mentor, the worldly alternative to a man in uniform. What Jane didn't know, though, what neither of them knew, was that William Smith had a record. Not just bad credit or unpaid parking tickets. We're talking actual time served. Financial crimes, shell companies, something with crypto he thought the feds missed. They didn't. And now neither had I. It was the beginning of a shift. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building something. A counterattack. A file. A case. Because if William thought he could waltz out of the country with my daughters and a woman who once wore my ring, he hadn't studied the kind of man I'd become. And if Jane thought this war would be fought in silence, she was about to hear what a soldier sounds like when he's finally decided to fire back. There's a line between betrayal and abandonment, and Jane didn't just cross it. She sprinted. It wasn't just that she'd lied, or even that she'd built a second life behind my back. It was that she did it while spending my money, using my name, under the roof I bled to provide. That hits a man somewhere deeper than anger, deeper than heartbreak. That lives in the chest like a pressure, heavy, constant, hard to breathe around. So I did what I was trained to do. I built a case. Quiet, deliberate, cold as a steel muzzle. I hired a forensic accountant. Every dollar, every transfer, every card swipe she made while I was deployed logged. Restaurant bills 2 states over. Flights charged to her business card. Payments to an unknown vendor that turned out to be a high-end property consultant in Florence. Jane wasn't just preparing to leave me. She was funding her escape with the very life I'd spent building ours. Worse yet were the patterns with the kids. I'd sent care packages, birthday messages, video calls that never got answered. And I'd believed the excuses. They're with their tutors. They're asleep early tonight. They're too emotional right now. I chalked it up to the cost of war. Turns out, Jane was softening the ground, isolating me, feeding them the idea that their father was unstable, damaged, not safe. I found emails to a therapist she'd hired, one who never spoke to me, never asked for my side. They're frightened when he calls, Jane wrote. They have nightmares after his videos. Lies, layered, strategic, and deliberate. I started documenting it all, not just the paper trail, the psychological warfare. The kids were being weaponized, and she was the one loading the magazine. My attorney prepped the next phase, evidence of parental alienation, financial fraud, and intent to flee the country with minors. We weren't just talking divorce anymore. This was crossing into criminal territory. But the final blow, the one that made my hands tremble, that pushed this from strategy to personal vendetta, came from a neighbor's doorbell camera. I'd asked around quietly, hoping for eyes on the house while I was away. And there it was. One rainy evening, 2 weeks before I came home, a short clip. William stepping on my front door, soaking wet, coat open, his arm around my youngest daughter. Jane behind them, laughing. It was a family scene, just not mine. You can't unsee something like that. You can't file it away like the rest of the evidence. That one lives in your bloodstream. So I pressed harder, dug deeper into William, found old court records buried under a previous alias. Charges of wire fraud, investment scams, a probation term still active. He wasn't even allowed to leave the state without permission, let alone the country. And yet there he was, planning a future in Italy with my daughters tucked under his arm. That's when I knew I wasn't just going to fight this. I was going to finish it. Sometimes justice doesn't kick the door down. It lets you open it slowly and walk the guilty through it. I didn't want spectacle. I didn't want headlines. What I wanted was precision. I wanted their house of lies to collapse from the inside. No drama, no fireworks. Just the quiet sound of consequences taking hold. And to do that, I had to start with the weak point. William Smith. His past wasn't squeaky clean. I'd already uncovered records from a decade ago. Fraud, wire scams, a crypto pyramid scheme that lost investors $500,000. He did 2 years in minimum security, walked out with a new alias and a self-help podcast. But a con man doesn't change stripes. He just changes suits. And now, he was wearing my life like a rental jacket, playing family man in my house, using my money, whispering lies into my daughter's ears. So I dug deeper, quietly, strategically. I brought in a private investigator, a quiet type, former federal, eyes like granite and a way of making people talk without raising his voice. Within a week, we had more than gossip. We had movement. William was still in contact with former associates, all of them on a federal watch list for financial crimes. There were flags on his accounts, transfers to obscure crypto wallets in Luxembourg and Estonia. And what really broke it open? Some of those transfers were being routed through Jane's name. Her bank login, her devices. She wasn't just cheating. She was laundering his past, whether she knew it or not. And then came the message that cut straight through my armor. It was from my daughter, the older one, 14, smarter than she let on. She reached me the only way she could, a shared playlist on a cloud account we used while I was deployed. One track added, and a note in the file name. He scares me. That was all she wrote. But that was enough. That was everything. I messaged her back through the app. Careful, slow, reassuring. Over the next week, she told me more. William wasn't just a liar. He was volatile. He drank at night, said cruel things, lost his temper. Once, she said, he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark. Jane had covered it up. It was an accident. He didn't mean it. The same old line women have used for centuries when fear wears a familiar face. That was the turning point. This wasn't about a custody battle anymore. This was about protection. I installed audio software on the tablet we'd given her last Christmas, disguised as a diagnostics app. The next time William was at the house, I recorded him, clear as day, his voice low and mean, telling Jane their exit plan had to move faster. We'll leave before the court date, he said. The passports are ready. He laughed, actually laughed, about how easy it was to get a forged notarization of my consent. We'll be drinking wine in Florence before he even knows they're gone. Then he started bragging about the scam, the crypto wallet he emptied, the investors he ghosted. Idiots, he said. The feds don't even know where to look. He was wrong. I brought the files, the audio, the transfers, the messages to my attorney and our federal liaison. Sat across the table and played them everything. They didn't interrupt, just scribbled notes. And when the tape ended, they didn't ask follow-ups. They said, we'll take it from here. William was arrested in broad daylight, downtown, holding Jane's purse while she ordered iced coffee. No warning, no scene, just a badge and a pair of cuffs. The laptop in her bag, the same one used to send money overseas, was quietly handed to an agent in gloves. Jane looked stunned, not devastated, not broken, just hollow, like the ground she'd built her new life on had crumbled beneath her feet, and she couldn't quite understand why. That was the trap. No screaming, no confrontation, just the weight of truth, timed perfectly. And it was only the beginning. There's no satisfaction in watching someone unravel, not when they once shared your bed, your children, your life. But there's a kind of stillness, a quiet acknowledgement that truth, even when it arrives late, has a weight that can't be outrun. Jane's collapse didn't come with sirens or handcuffs. Hers was quieter, slower, like a building with a cracked foundation finally leaning too far to pretend it was ever stable. After William's arrest, things moved faster than I expected. The FBI moved in with quiet efficiency, issuing subpoenas, seizing devices, freezing bank accounts, including the joint one she hadn't yet cleared out. Jane's world didn't explode. It imploded. She came home that night to find the locks changed on the accounts, her cards declined, her phone buzzing with emails she couldn't answer. Her lawyer, the one who once looked at me like I was nothing more than a military ghost too damaged to parent, stopped returning her calls. But the part that stays with me was the hearing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even long. Just a courtroom, sterile and quiet, the kind of place where the air feels too thin to breathe properly. Jane sat across from me, a pale blue blouse buttoned too high at the neck, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl caught cheating. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They stayed down, flickering across the table, trying not to settle on the printed transcripts, the recordings, the flagged transactions, the emails with William that outlined a plan so calculated, so cold, it still turns my stomach to this day. She tried to speak, claimed ignorance, said William had manipulated her, that she hadn't known about the offshore accounts, about the laundering, about the forged travel documents. But the facts didn't lie. Her login, her name, her voice in the recordings, she wasn't just along for the ride. She had her hands on the wheel. And the judge? He didn't need much. He was a straight-back man with a weathered face and eyes that didn't blink when they read through a lie. After the evidence was laid out, after I handed over the recordings, the text from my daughter, the flag transactions, he looked up, quiet, and simply said, "Immediate joint custody to the father, supervised visitation for the mother, and an investigation pending." No one in the room said a word. He glanced over at Shane. Her face didn't break. It sagged, like a mask melting under a hot light. For a second, I saw the person she used to be. The woman who once cried with me in a hospital hallway the night our first daughter was born. And then it passed. Because that version of her, the one I trusted, was gone. Replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. Someone who stood by while our daughters were folded into a man's criminal blueprint. Later that day, I stood outside the courthouse with both girls. My youngest held my hand like it was something she hadn't touched in years. My eldest didn't let go either, not even after we reached the car. And in their silence, I felt something settle. Not peace, but gravity, like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath our feet. Jane walked past us in the parking lot, heels sharp on the concrete, her expression fixed somewhere between pride and panic. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word, and I didn't follow. There was nothing left to chase. I got in the car, both girls buckled in behind me, and for the first time in a long time, the road ahead looked open. There's a strange kind of silence that follows victory. Not the kind you celebrate with flags or medals, but the kind that comes with knowing something is finally, irrevocably over. After the court ruled in my favor, there were no cheers, no applause, just the soft closing of a courtroom door and the sound of my daughter's breathing in the backseat of my car. They were quiet, unsure, but they were with me. And that was enough for now. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork and tension. The kind of admin war most people never see. Parenting plans, therapy approvals, school transitions, all layered in cautious language from people paid to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not yet. My daughters were still learning how to trust the air around them again. Still flinching at sudden tones. Still asking every now and then if I was going to leave again. And every time, I told them the truth. Not a chance. Jane stayed quiet. Her visits were limited to short, supervised windows at a neutral facility. Clean walls, security cameras, staff who pretended they weren't watching. The girls were distant. Cordial, maybe, but not warm. They sensed it too, the fracture. The absence of that maternal certainty they once clung to. Jane tried to smile through it, brought gifts, tried to spin stories about bad choices and needing time to figure things out. But kids aren't dumb. They see through soft lies faster than adults do. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding. Not the house, that was gone. I left the old place behind. Too many shadows in those walls. I bought a small home 2 towns over. Nothing fancy, just solid bones, space for the girls, a backyard where we could make new memories that didn't carry echoes. The first thing I set up was their bedroom. Same colors they'd picked years ago. Same posters I'd saved from storage. I even hung the little fairy lights they used to read under at night. It was slow, this rebuilding. Trust didn't flow back in. It trickled. My eldest started opening up again. About school, about her fears, about how she used to watch the door at night, wondering who William really was when the lights went off. My youngest began drawing again. Not dark stuff, either, not shadows or broken hearts, but trees, animals, little families with wide smiles and stars over their heads. It was working. Bit by bit, it was working. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Jane called. Not a court-mandated call. Not a legal maneuver. Just her. She asked to meet. Said it wasn't about custody. Said she needed to say something. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Neutral place. Public. I owed her nothing, but I was still human. She showed up late. Sat across from me in a weathered cafe, looking tired. Older than I remembered. And for the first time in months, she didn't pretend. Nos mais. No explanations. I was wrong, she said. I let her speak. She admitted everything. Not just about William, but about the months she spent rewriting who I was to our kids. About how the stress, the fear, the loneliness became an excuse. How she let herself believe that taking them from me was safer than facing the cracks in herself. I didn't know how to come back from it, she said. And by the time I did, you were already gone. I said nothing. Not because I hadn't imagined that moment. I had. But because part of me had stopped needing it. I know you'll never forgive me, she said. And she was right. But forgiveness wasn't the point anymore. Peace was. Some wounds don't bleed. They just burn slow, like a coal buried under ash. You can't see them, but they're there. They smolder. That's how it felt in the weeks after Jane's apology. I didn't walk away from that cafe angry. Just empty. Not the kind of emptiness that aches, but the kind that makes you realize how much space you've cleared for something better. She never asked for forgiveness outright. That, at least, she understood. But what stayed with me more than her words was how fragile she looked. Not in the physical sense, but in that way people look when they finally see the damage they've done and know they can't undo it. That's a different kind of broken. Well, I didn't need to fix. Back home, the girls were adjusting, cautiously, like deer on a thawing lake. They still had questions. Not the kind that needed answers, but the kind that needed presence. And that's what I gave them. Presence. Every day. I cooked breakfast. I walked them to school. I showed up to parent-teacher nights and soccer games and the occasional meltdown about homework. I didn't try to be the fun dad. I tried to be the consistent one, the man they could depend on without hesitation. It was in the ordinary things that healing happened. One evening, my youngest fell asleep on the couch beside me, face buried in my side. My eldest left her phone face down and asked me to explain how to build a basic budget. Not earth-shaking moments, but they meant everything. Those little signs that the wall was coming down brick by brick. The house started to feel like a home. I added things slowly, a grill on the back porch, a hammock between the two maples, a dog we rescued from a local shelter. The girls named him Ranger. He barked at delivery trucks like it was his personal duty and slept curled up between their bedrooms. For the first time in a long time, laughter started coming from the walls. Not forced, not hesitant. Just real. Jane's visits remained supervised, though she never protested. She came with quieter eyes and fewer stories. She asked about school, remembered birthdays, brought small, thoughtful gifts. The girls received her with politeness. Kindness even, but the closeness? That was gone. That takes longer to rebuild, if it ever comes back at all. As for me, I didn't date. Not yet. Not seriously. There were a few conversations, some glances. But I wasn't ready to invite someone else into a story that was still healing. I needed to be whole first. Needed to know that when I looked in the mirror, I wasn't seeing just a survivor. I was seeing a father, a protector, a man who came back from war only to fight a different kind of battle, and won. Because make no mistake, I did win. Not in the court, not over Jane, but in the quiet spaces where men either break or rebuild. And I chose to rebuild. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a long storm. Not the eerie kind that keeps you waiting for the next hit, but the kind where you realize it's actually over. And it leaves you standing there, not sure what to do with the quiet. In the months after the court ruling, life didn't snap back to normal. It stretched slowly, like a muscle healing after too long in tension. The girls were adjusting in their own ways. My youngest, always the first to speak, the first to laugh, had turned inward, more cautious. She still smiled, but it took more to earn it. My eldest had grown sharp, not in a cruel way, but in a way that made me realize how much she'd seen, how much she'd been forced to understand before she should have had to. We were all figuring it out. I kept our world simple. School, dinners, bedtime routines, small weekend trips to the lake or the arcade. The kinds of things I used to miss while I was deployed. I gave them consistency. I gave them presence. And slowly, they started to trust the floor under their feet again. Jane, meanwhile, faded into the periphery. Not completely. She still had her visitation rights, still showed up on time with the same pleasant tone and nervous smile. But something in her had changed. Maybe it was humility. Maybe it was shame. But she no longer pushed, no longer tried to rewrite the past with soft stories or half apologies. Our communication was strictly business now. Calendars, school updates, medical appointments. A neutral tone, stripped of memory. And for the most part, that worked. It gave everyone space to breathe. But it wasn't the absence of drama that stayed with me. It was the moment it tried to return. One afternoon, after a supervised visit, Jane lingered by the car. The girls were already buckled in, Ranger curled up in the back seat. She looked tired, not worn down, but hollow, like someone carrying something too heavy for too long. "I need to ask you something," she said. I stayed still, measured, watching. "Do you hate me?" I looked at her, this woman who'd once been my partner, the one who turned my daughters against me, who'd stood beside a criminal and nearly vanished with everything I loved. "No," I said, and I meant it. "I don't." But that wasn't forgiveness. That was clarity. She nodded, and in that gesture, I saw a flicker of the woman I once loved. Not enough to return to, not enough to mourn, just enough to release. After that day, things got simpler. She no longer tried to stretch moments into meaning. She stuck to her hours, sent updates when needed, and gradually stepped back from the fantasy she'd built. And I focused on what was real. The girls began to thrive. My eldest passed her driving test, her face breaking into a grin I hadn't seen since before the war. My youngest placed in her school science fair and asked if we could build a birdhouse together. We did. It didn't win any awards, but it held up through 3 rainstorms. That was enough. And one night, after the house was quiet, after I'd checked both rooms and turned off all the lights, I stood on the porch. Ranger in my feet, the night breeze soft, the smell of cut grass still lingering in the air. I stared out into the dark and let the silence in. This wasn't the life I expected, but it was the life I earned. Half a year passed. 6 months since the courtroom, since the arrests, since the world I thought I knew was flipped, gutted, and rebuilt piece by piece. Time moved differently now, not slow, but honest. Measured, like everything finally had a rhythm again. The house had settled into its bones. The rooms no longer echoed. The girls filled them with laughter, complaints, bad music, and homework stress. The real, messy stuff of life. I loved every second of it. The dog scratched at the back door each morning, expecting a walk before breakfast, and the kitchen carried the scent of coffee and burnt toast more often than I'd admit. These weren't dramatic changes, just right ones. Jane had faded into something distant. Not hostile, just no longer central. Her visits remained structured and calm. The girls approached her with care now, like she was a relative they respected but didn't rely on. I never poisoned them against her. I didn't need to. Truth has its own gravity, and they'd seen enough to know where safety lived. For me, the shift was quieter, deeper. I'd started running again, not out of stress or guilt, just because I missed the sound of my feet on pavement. I slept better, ate more, spent less time staring at nothing. Some nights, I even read again, not strategy manuals or court transcripts, but fiction, stories that reminded me that people can be complicated and still worth something. And then, unexpectedly, there was someone new. I met her at the hardware store of all places. She worked there part-time, helping her brother run the register. We struck up a conversation over paint samples. She laughed at something I said, then offered a better brand suggestion. It wasn't a spark, not immediately, just a pause, a moment. And when she handed me my receipt, her eyes held steady. We talked again, then again. It took a month before I mentioned the girls. Another before she met them. In public, short and careful. She didn't push, didn't perform. She listened. She asked the right questions. And when my eldest gave a shy nod of approval and my youngest asked if she liked dogs, I felt something shift. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was space for it. And that's what mattered. Not everyone gets a second chance. Not every soldier returns home to rebuild. And certainly not every broken man finds a way to stand again without bitterness. But I did. Not because I'm special, but because I refuse to let betrayal define me. I carry the scars. Always will. But they don't sting like they used to. They remind me of what I came through. Of who I protected. Of who I still am. A father. A fighter. A man who stood at the edge and didn't fall. And every night now, as I lock the door and check the windows, I feel something I thought I'd lost. Not pride. Not peace. Just belonging. And in this life, the life I fought for, that's everything.